Before we start, I want to give you an update on what's going on in Washington. So, as you may have heard, today the news was all about the Epstein files, which apparently were the phase one was a little disappointing. But earlier this week, X was on fire with Representative Luna. She was posting actively about her efforts to try to get a response from the Department of Justice. As you recall, last week she sent a letter requesting an update by yesterday. And earlier in the week, she mentioned that she had spoken to the National Archives and they had made a commitment to her that as soon as the records were released, they would post and make them available online to the American people. So she posted about that. And then apparently she posted that she wasn't getting a response from the Department of Justice. This was on the 25th. And X was going crazy on about why are you even waiting to review records? Just release the damn things. Yesterday, she got a response, not from the Attorney General, but from the person in charge of the Office of Congressional Liaison with the Department of Justice, indicating that they were continuing to review the records and that they were going to comply with the law and also are sensitive to law enforcement issues, and will get back to her shortly. If I was in her shoes, I would be really pissed that I'm not hearing directly from the Attorney General and just the head of the Office of Congressional Liaison. So I don't know what to make of that. Clearly, the Department of Justice was focusing on Epstein this week, but that's where things are. We're still waiting to get the letter from the Attorney General, and that the Attorney General has jurisdiction over the FBI, the DEA, and the ATF, which all have records postponed. So we're waiting for the Department of Justice's plan to declassify those records. And obviously, there's going to be something from the National Security Advisor, and then also the Director of National Intelligence. So we don't have anything new besides that. It's a little obviously troubling that over a month after 5 weeks after the president's executive order, when he asked for a plan in 15 days, the plan hasn't even been submitted yet. So stay tuned. We'll see if this is a sign that this is really much ado about nothing, or whether they're just going through a genuine process of trying to vet the records. I assume that Attorney General said that she had records on her desk, whether they were the transparency plans or whether the records themselves. I presume a combination of both. She's probably trying to figure out the transparency plans postpone these records, and can we really release them now under the president's order? So that is where we are right now. I'm going to send another letter to the president's the White House counsel next week, asking for additional records to be searched. There's some people have been contacting me, and want to supplement my prior letter. So before we turn to Lewis, does anyone have any questions, any comments about where we are with the JFK Records Act? Hearing none.
I'll ask. I could chime in then if no one else does.
Go ahead.
I think it's unacceptable. Everything you just explained is completely unacceptable. But to get into specifics, first of all, Representative Luna from Florida is the last person who should be going through these, because she has a constituency of Cuban Americans who may have cousins, grandfathers, fathers, and they could be big donors of hers. So I don't like any time a politician is involved, especially from one of the places which could be a hot spot. That's first and foremost. Second of all, I don't know why someone isn't just marching in there and taking the records like Trump did towards the end of his last administration. He did that at one point. He sent someone across the street to just take them for something. You'll probably recall what exactly it was, right?
Okay. Well,
I mean, it been Ratcliffe. It might have been who's
oh,
now.
Right, Radcliffe. Yeah, Radcliffe released records.
Right.
I think regarding the Russian investigation.
That was what it was then. So why, we need something like that now. We waited 60 years for this. I don't want any last minute. Whatever's been destroyed has been destroyed already. We anticipate that already. We understand that, but we don't want any last minute destructions happening as well. And that's what I feel. I mean, look, I'm from the streets. This stinks to high heaven.
Right.
There's something wrong here.
So, by way of introduction, Louis Ferrante was a former crew chief for the Gambino crowd, Gambino family, and he served time in jail for stuff he did, and he spent after he came out, he spent a lot of time, researching what he knows from his connections with the mafia and other stuff. And he's come up with a book. Louis, the people on this call, we're familiar with the mafia Castro assassination attempts.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to go too much into the history.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you kind of go into your thesis and then how you think this plan kind of was executed? Mm-hmm. And then when you're finished, we can talk about, Trafficante and Giancana and other players and Roselli and other players, that may have been played a role.
Okay, great. So just for a little background, I ran a crew within the Gambino crime family for many years. I went to prison for a long time. I faced life in prison. I was represented by the late William Kunstler when I faced trial and faced life in prison. I befriended him. I became pretty close with him. I used to go to his house on Gay Street in the Village where he lived. And I eventually ducked a life sentence. And while I was in prison, I studied law, amongst other things, philosophy, history, and I fell in love with books. I had never read a book cover to cover before in my life. Although I was literate, I went to little school, grade school, but I never picked up a book. No one in my family ever read a book. I think the first book my father ever read when he was in his 60s, which was the first book I wrote for HarperCollins. So, I mean, we just didn't come from an educated family that stressed education. It was a hardworking Italian family. My father's parents were immigrants, as well as my mother's. My mother's came from, they all came from Italy, different parts of Italy. So I reversed one of my cases with the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, pro se, after hiring, Kunstler died while representing me. I hired and fired another 6 attorneys, 7 total, before I had studied law, filed my own briefs with the Second Circuit, and reversed one of my cases, my FBI case, which was a RICO/Hobbs Act. It was a Hobbs Act, which is like a RICO indictment, interstate commerce. It was based on heists and hijackings. So having taught myself the art of writing while I was in prison, I became a writer when I came home. I've been home quite a few years. A chance meeting with Lord George Weidenfeld, one of the most prolific book publishers of the 20th century, who escaped the Holocaust, fled Austria when the Wehrmacht rolled in. Chance meeting in Sicily. We hit it off. We both were lovers of history. I did not know he was Lord George Weidenfeld. He had introduced himself as George. He was a very humble man. And he introduced his wife as Annabelle, who turned out to be Lady Annabelle. And at the end of the evening, he said, "I would like to publish your next book." And I said, "Well, who are you, first of all? And then, and what would that be?" And he wanted me to write a history of the mafia. And so it was an offer I couldn't refuse. It morphed into a trilogy. Yeah. And it morphed into a trilogy. And I had no idea when I started it that book 2 of the trilogy, which was just released just last month, would revolve around the Kennedy assassination. And the more I read, the more I became a true believer that not only was he assassinated by a cabal of multiple parties, but also that the mob played a starring role in that cabal. And the lead starring character would be Carlos Marcello, as you said. So when I started to research it, the more evidence I read, the more I couldn't believe it. And then I began to talk to people I knew, obviously old timers and things they heard. But most of the information came from archives, um, and with an insight into how mobsters think. I was around mobsters my whole life. I was around, for those of the people on this call may remember the Gottis. John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino crime family. I was in and out of Peter Gotti's house for the better part of 6 or 7 years until I went to prison. Peter Gotti was John Gotti's brother and eventually became the boss of the Gambino family. And then I was away many years with mobsters, mob bosses, consiglières, underbosses. I know how they think, and I understand how Marcello would have thought. When Marcello locked horns with Bobby Kennedy, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, and Kennedy vowed to destroy Marcello along with the rest of the mafia in America, Marcello knew it was omerta. Him, Bobby or him would have to fight to the death. And that's how the mob thinks. It's you or me. Somebody's got to go. And he felt it was him or Bobby. And Marcello originally wanted to kill Bobby. And at some point, his talk to people around him went from killing Bobby to killing Jack. And when asked why he would kill Jack, he said, well, if you cut the tail off a dog, the head will still bite you. You have to cut the head off and the dog will die head and tail together. Bobby was just the tail. Jack was the head. On another occasion, he said, if I kill Bobby, Jack will send out the National Guard for all of us. If I kill Jack, Bobby will be disempowered overnight. Now, he's only one element of the conspiracy. At the same time, as your listeners and viewers would know, the mafia is rather one part of this. There's also the Cuban exile community and their CIA handlers. And after Kennedy abandoned Brigade 2506 on the beaches of Cuba and left them without air cover and support, naval support, and no one linked up with them and drove inland as they were promised, they hated and despised Kennedy. And the second debacle was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they felt, okay, he abandoned us on the beaches, but here's another opportunity to get back our homeland. And we trust that Kennedy will do the right thing. And everyone, including the Joint Chiefs and the Hawks and Kennedy's administration, were urging Kennedy to invade. We would no longer look like the imperialist mercenaries Castro was painting us as. We would be defenders of freedom, removing a threat 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Get in there, remove the threat, and take Castro with it. That's what everybody believed. And the Cuban exile community here in America was literally biting their fingernails, waiting for Kennedy to pull the trigger on that one. And not only did he not invade and chose instead to quarantine the island, whether we agree with that or not, he said from his point of view, he was avoiding a nuclear holocaust. There might be some truth to that. I personally believe, as did the Joint Chiefs, as did Lyndon Johnson, that we should have went in. I don't believe Khrushchev would have. I don't believe Khrushchev was as crazy as he made himself out to be, and I don't believe he would have gotten himself into a nuclear war. That said, we don't know. So let's say either way, who knows? Maybe Jack Kennedy made the right decision. But either way, I need to focus on how the Cuban exile community and their CIA handlers received that decision. And they felt it was tantamount to treason. And Kennedy made a side deal with Nikita Khrushchev that he not only would not invade the island, but he promised that he wouldn't in the future as well. And to uphold that promise, the Cuban exiles who were trained to retake that island were the mascots of freedom, the champions of liberty, and overnight, they became criminal targets of the Kennedy administration because he instructed AG Bobby Kennedy to stop them from any sabotage missions. Coast Guard cutters were pulling them over at sea in the Caribbean. They were arrested in the Bahamas in concert with British authorities. So the Cuban exile community and their CIA handlers are now defunded. They had received up until that point 100 or 200 million dollars. It's not classified. We don't know the exact amount, but somewhere in that area. And now they're getting nothing. And the mafia is considered a government within a government. From Estes Kefalva, I believe, said that during the Kefalva committee hearings. So they're considered a government within a government. When the United States government defunded the exiles and considered them criminal targets, they went to the next government, which was the mafia. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Marcello was funding them at their training camps in and around Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. And his buddy, Santo Trafficante, the Don of Florida, was also funding them in Florida at their training camps. So, and also Marcello had a lot to do with Guatemala, which was the main training camp, the CIA training camp where the exiles were trained before they went to Cuba. And Marcello had a lot to do with that. He obtained a fraudulent birth certificate from Guatemala. So now you have, just to put the three elements together before I move on more deeply to Marcello, you have the CIA handlers who feel that Kennedy's inaction is tantamount to treason, and the Cuban exiles feel the same way. They've gone from champions of liberty to criminal targets of the Kennedy administration. They despise Kennedy. And you have the mob who despises Kennedy, specifically Carlos Marcello, who was illegally deported by Bobby Kennedy. So when Bobby goes after Carlos Marcello, he not only destroys his life, but at some point he wants to deport him back to Sicily, where his ancestors are from, or Tunisia, where his parents lived before they came to America. There was a Sicilian exile community in Tunisia. So Bobby's looking to send them across the ocean. And Marcello, afraid to be sent that far away where he'll lose contact with his Borgata and his family and the $1 billion a year Aaron Cohn said he was earning in his rackets, $1 billion. He was earning over $1 billion.
Bigger than U.S. Steel.
That's correct. And now the mob as a large entity was bigger than U.S. Steel, as Meyer Lansky famously said. But not only that, Marcello is a single part of the mob, and he alone is doing over $1 billion. Him alone. So that's just at his own fingertips. So Marcello now says, well, I can't get booted across the Atlantic Ocean. Where am I going to go? And he looks around Latin America, and he decides that it's a quick trip across the Gulf. He's going to get a fraudulent birth certificate from Guatemala, and he sends people there with $100,000 to bribe government officials. And they add his name in a little village to a records book, and the ink didn't match, unfortunately, but everything else matched. Unfortunately for him, I should say, because it was exposed. Bobby sent a prosecutor there after he learned about it and found out that it was a fraudulent birthright. And he knowing it was fraudulent, Bobby Kennedy booted Marcello out of the country. He instructed General Joseph Swing of the INS to escort him out of the country immediately. And he went to one day sign in at the Masonic Temple building where the INS offices were, and he was snatched, put on a plane, and sent to Guatemala. Well, he lands there, and he immediately sets up a satellite office, has his brothers come down with suitcases filled with cash. His family comes to visit him, and he's already meeting with all of the big corporate bigwigs in Guatemala. And he's starting to invest in a shrimp fleet. He's investing in the racetrack, and he's meeting with different people. And Bobby's incensed now that he's picked up so quickly, and there's pressure now on the Guatemalan president to eject him, and he sends him to Honduras. And he goes through a 17-mile trek through the jungles, trying to survive and get to civilization. And he breaks ribs. He's all scratched up and beat up, huffing and puffing. He's not in the best shape. He's been living a very luxurious life as a mob boss at this point. He's in his 50s. And he tells his attorney who made the trek with him, if you survive and I don't, tell my brothers to do what they got to do with that Bobby. Tell them to make sure they go to Bobby and they do what they got to do with that Bobby. Do what you got to do when the mob means kill somebody. If I say to a friend, look, do what you got to do, that means kill the guy. Or if somebody says to me, Louis, the guy's got a beef with you, do what you got to do. That means if you want to kill him, kill him. He's telling the attorney to make sure his brothers know to kill Bobby if he doesn't make it. Well, he makes it. And there's this, because Bobby made so many enemies and Jack, You have the rogue CIA agents who are the handlers of the Cuban exiles. You have the militant Cuban exiles, and you have Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, who also despise the Kennedys. Now, that said, there's a man who comes into Marcello's life, and his name is David Ferry. And he came into Marcello's life because of the cases. This is the irony. Because of the fraudulent case that Bobby brought against Marcello, the fraudulent deportation to start with, when Marcello returns, now he doubles down Bobby and he has him arrested for illegal reentry. Knowing that the original deportation was illegal, Bobby doubles down and rearrests him now for illegal reentry. That case, he has an attorney, and the man who works for that attorney and does a lot of private investigative work for him is David Ferry. And David Ferry becomes very close with Carlos Marcello. David Ferry is a pilot who ran sabotage missions into Cuba. He despised Castro. He hated communists. And he believed in the domino theory. If we let Cuba go red, the rest of Latin America may fall. And David Ferry is now very close friends with Carlos Marcello. And the Cuban exiles who were defunded by the American government suddenly have a lot of money flowing to them through David Ferry. And everyone was unanimously believed it was coming from Carlos Marcello. So Marcello is funding the exiles. And he's also now, I believe, at some point begins to fund the conspiracy to kill Jack Kennedy. And the reason why I believe that is because before Kennedy is killed, there are informants that say, hey, when Kennedy comes down south, there's $1 million on his head. And this was a man who knew Carlos Marcello's brothers. And it was said by a man who was in Carlos Marcello's Borgata. Hey, there's $1 million on Kennedy's head. When he comes down south, if you want to take him out, there's $1 million on his head. This is going around. Then at some point, Santo Trafficante meets with Cuban exile Jose Aleman. And they're talking about Kennedy. And Aleman says, hey, just wait him out. Maybe he'll get, pushed out of office in the next election. And he said, no, Jose, he's going to be killed before the election. This is months before the assassination in Dealey Plaza. And Jose Aleman is an FBI informant. And he goes straight to his handlers and he says, look, I just met with Santo Trafficante and he just told me that Kennedy will be killed before the election. And the agents run it up the chain, but nothing happens. So why isn't Hoover doing anything? Well, that's a crucial question. Why is Hoover now? Not only Hoover receives the threat from Trafficante, but he also gets it on his desk, the threats that are coming from Carlos Marcello. There are also other mobsters across the country who are saying Kennedy's going to be killed. Why isn't Hoover doing anything about these threats? Okay. Hoover and Bobby immediately locked horns as well. Bobby hated Hoover and said to Hoover when Bobby became Attorney General, you're under me. You go through me to go to the Oval Office. You don't just walk up Pennsylvania Avenue whenever you feel like it, which you've been doing for decades. Hoover did that for decades. You have to go through me as the Attorney General. He started also editing FBI press releases. This was anathema to Hoover. And he was also every which way despised Hoover and told Hoover, you need to forget about communists. You need to go after the mob. Well, Hoover didn't want to go after the mob because he believed that all of the mob's influence, having illegal eavesdropping devices all across the country, he knew that they were putting in mayors, they were putting in governors, they were putting in congressmen. Their power went straight up to Washington. So Hoover was like, well, what do you want me to do? Surround the Capitol Rotunda and tell everyone to come out with their hands up? You know where this leads. So Hoover is basically being dragged into this fight against the mob, kicking and screaming. And Bobby despises Hoover and wants to get rid of him. And not only does he start to plan and tell people if Jack gets reelected, Hoover's gone, but he also, an assistant director for the FBI, said that we were out. Bobby was trying to literally, and members of the Justice Department said this, and this all sourced in my book, by the way, Clash of Titans, part of the Borgata trilogy. All the source notes are in the back. I never just throw anything out there. They said that Bobby was trying to smear Hoover as a homosexual so that he would destroy, not only make sure he gets done and booted from the FBI, but he's smeared and done forever. Now, any of us today, any Americans today, all of us are fine with gays. We all have gays in our family. We all have gay friends. It's not a big deal to be gay in our society today. So it's hard for like millennials to realize what it was like in the 1960s for the gay community. They had to hide. And you especially couldn't be the head of the director of the FBI if you were gay. So this was really literally a threat to Hoover's life. I mean, he's looking to destroy decades of a reputation that Hoover has built and smear him as a homosexual and get him booted out of the FBI. Hoover's life is finished. So this might be why Hoover was ignoring all the threats against Jack Kennedy for want of them to succeed.
Hey, Lewis, John Davis thought that he had some speculation that Hoover, no, it wasn't, it was Anthony Summers, that Frank Costello was giving Hoover tips on fixed racehorses, and that he was making money off of this, and that this is why when they started circling around Marcello in December of '63, Hoover called him off. That he did not. That was another reason that that they couldn't go after him. But you also had an interesting thing said on C-SPAN about Hoover's view of our institutions.
That's great. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Larry. Basically, there was a lot of information. It is true, yes, what you said. Frank Costello would give Hoover tips on races. And I believe that I spoke about it in the first volume of my book. I went deep into it actually when Costello would somehow end up in a barber chair across from Hoover in the Waldorf Astoria. And and then they each had a story for why they might bump into each other, which was interesting. So yes, he was getting horse racing tips. Now Hoover would also bet like $1 at the dollar window, but then he would have somebody go put $100 bet, maybe even 1,000. Who knows? Who knows how steep the bets were? So he was a gambler. He was always at the racetrack. Literally the day after Kennedy was killed in Dealey Plaza, Hoover went to the racetrack. So he was a gambler.
Saturday morning, he was at the racetrack.
Yep, that's right. And so I grew up in a home like that. My father was a gambler. I grew up in Aqueduct, Belmont. This is where I spent my childhood. I grew up in the OTB. For those of us who remember the OTB, off-track betting, I used to be sitting in an OTB with all 67-year-olds, when I'm 5 years old, literally up to their knees. So I could totally see how Hoover liked the relationship with Costello. He liked to gamble. But would that be the impetus to leave the mob alone? I did not feel I believe that he could have left Costello alone and still got the tips and went after the mob, because other people were prosecuted by Governor Dewey. Other people were gone after by Senator Estes Kefauver. You could still pick and choose who you're going to go after. And there was another rumor that I read, a lot of rumors that circulated saying that the mob had compromising pictures of Hoover. So it was suspected that Hoover was very close with Clyde Tolson, and who rose up through the ranks of the CIA and became assistant director very quickly. They vacationed together. Both were lifelong bachelors. So there was sort of suspicion that they were together and they were a pair. However, I do not believe that there was real evidence to suggest that the mob had anything. And I don't believe Hoover was dumb enough to allow anybody to get material. Hoover was an expert blackmailer himself. And people who are really, really good at something like that would be very, very defensive against it happening to them. And there's never any evidence that it comes out. So I tried to trace the original source of where that may have come from. And it seems to have come from a socialite at a party who was trying to disparage Hoover as gay and said that that's why he doesn't go after the mob, because the mob has pictures of him cross-dressing and stuff. And she threw out some stuff that was then picked up by journalists and then picked up by historians. And then each journalist and historian would cite the last as their source, but it didn't seem to go anywhere when I traced it. What I felt was the biggest possibility. And I'd bet $1 million on it right now. I am positive this was why. Hoover was, as many people, you could throw barbs at Hoover, and he's been shot with slings and arrows since his death. He's violated people's civil rights and stuff. And I don't agree what he's done with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. You could go on and on about things that he may have done that would be considered unpatriotic. However, I believe in Hoover's own worldview, he was extremely patriotic. I believe that Hoover felt that there were groups that were threats to America as a way of life and its institutions and its government. And I felt that he did not feel the mob rose to that level. And so, for example, Hoover went after communists. He wrote a number of books about his hunt for communists. And he always felt that that was the biggest threat to American, a democratic capitalist society. He could look over at Russia even before the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. You still had Lenin and then Stalin, who were dictators, and they despised the capitalist society, and there was no democracy there. There was a Politburo. So Hoover felt that communism was a threat to America and its institutions. However, he never felt the mob was. The mob helped naval intelligence during World War II. The mob needs a democratic capitalist society to thrive in. They were quite happy with the American system. They came here, most of them from Sicily and southern Italy, and they left behind what they felt was a horrible system. And they felt that this was the best system you could have in America, where you could underwrite a gubernatorial race. Carlos Marcello, Michael Dorman was a journalist who wrote a book where he touched on a lot about Carlos Marcello underwriting both gubernatorial candidates in a race where he didn't care who won or lost. He had them in his pocket. He would put the mayor in. He would put the judges in. Frank Costello would put judges in. There was at one point there was a wire on Frank Costello's telephone, and a Supreme Court justice in New York called Costello and said, "Thanks for the appointment, Frank." And Frank said, "No problem. Anything I could do for you." And then they took a deep dive into Costello's relationship with Tammany Hall, and everywhere they went, they said, "Who's Frank Costello?" And it turns out that not only did he put everybody in the different wards, but then he had enough wards then to pick who was the head of Tammany Hall. And they were all pretending they didn't even know what the prosecutor was talking about. So they were never a threat to the American way of life and an American system because they worked within it. When naval intelligence went to Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky during World War II and said, "Look, we've got U-boats being sighted off the coast of Long Island, and a boat burned in port. We don't know if it was sabotage. We believe it was an accident, but the Germans may do some sabotage on the docks. And we are the arsenal of the democracies, not only supplying Great Britain, but at that point we were also supplying the Soviet Union because Stalin was allied with us. FDR, Stalin, and Churchill. So we cannot risk losing the port of New York or all of the Eastern Seaboard. Will you help us? Because the mafia controls the docks." And Meyer Lansky famously said, "You have no idea. We are patriotic Americans, and Lucky Luciano loves this country, and he'd be happy to help." And Lansky talked with Luciano's voice, with Luciano's tongue. Lansky was like Luciano's unofficial consigliere. He couldn't be an official consigliere because he was Jewish and he couldn't get made into the family. So, but everybody in the Borgata, everybody in the family knew that if you want to talk to Luciano, go to Lansky, because Luciano was in prison and the only person who could speak with his tongue is Meyer Lansky. And so Lansky said, "I could promise you, I'll go visit Luciano, but I could already pre-promise you that they will do everything they can to help, and so will I." And
So I think you said, so we can move it along. I think you said that that Hoover felt if they did a forensic investigation on the mafia's role in the assassination,
yeah,
it would reveal the entanglements the mafia had in our institutions, and that would be more of a threat to our country than the communists.
that's exactly right. So Hoover knew, just even if Hoover tried to teach Bobby in so many words and through example, that if you really want me to do a deep dive into the mafia, not only do all of these connections, a forensic accounting of all of their money will lead to congressmen, senators, maybe even the White House, but it was definitely the White House. So the mob backed Kennedy. Joe Kennedy was crooked. This is extremely important. Joe Kennedy was crooked. During the bootlegging years, he worked with the mob. He also had a B-rate Hollywood production company that needed labor relations to be smooth. He worked with the mob on that level as well. And this didn't come from just mobsters like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Bonanno. only the killer Madden, but it also came from members of the Kennedy family and members of the Kennedy clan who said, yes, Joe Kennedy worked with the mob. People that Jack made judges, he appointed as judges, would later say, I knew Joe for years. Joe was definitely in the mob. He couldn't have got as far as he did without mob influence and mob backing and the mob allowing him to do what he did. Even after Prohibition, he had a liquor distribution company. The distribution of liquor was controlled by Frank Costello. You could not have had that company without the mob's backing or without their okay. So at some point, Joe Kennedy says, look, forget about what my son Bobby did to you during the Rackets Committee, formerly known as the McClellan Committee. Forget about all that. Forget about that Jack also sat on the committee. My boys, once they get into the White House, they're going to forget about the mob. I need your backing. And the mob, for the most part, believed it because Frank Sinatra was sort of the ambassador to the mob for the Kennedy family and the chief liaison. Sinatra persuaded guys like Sam Giancana of Chicago and the New York bosses who helped him become a famous guy when he was starting out in New Jersey. They said, look, Sinatra says, look, the Kennedys aren't going to care about the mob. They're going to move on. They're going to move on to things like civil rights for African Americans, slowing down the nuclear arms race with the Soviets. They're not going to be caring about. Now, the mob had every reason to believe that because after Dewey was a prosecutor, he ran for the governor of New York and he forgot about the mob. Then he ran for the Republican nomination for president and he forgot about the mob. He didn't care about them any longer. Senator Estes Kefauver, for all of the hemming and hawing he did about the mob, once he ran for the Democratic nomination for president, he forgot about the mob. So they did typically, people didn't make a name for themselves and then move on. The mob believed that the Kennedys would do the same thing. So they backed them not only in the West Virginia primary, and there's overwhelming evidence that I bring up in my book that they sent money into the West Virginia primary when Kennedy eked it out against Hubert Humphrey. But also in Illinois, Sam Giancana made sure all of the crucial wards went for Kennedy, and he made sure that Illinois was delivered on a silver platter for Kennedy.
So, Louis, we know that Marcello has the means and the motive to go after Kennedy, but what was the opportunity? That's the thing that the largest knock against the mafia did it is how do you manipulate Oswald, and then how do you get the government to fake, basically cover up, perform an autopsy that's not,
Yeah, so this is crucial what you're saying. So the mob could never have done this alone. So at some point, Marcello, I think the chief player, David Ferry, was considered by the Cuban exiles as the quote unquote master of intrigue. And they said that he loved weaving these intricate plots, and they named him this, the master of intrigue. So I believe at some point, Marcello comes into contact with David Ferry, and they become very, very close. And all of a sudden, Sergio Arcacha Smith, who's head of the CRC, which is the umbrella group that pretty much all of the other militant exile groups are beneath, suddenly Sergio Arcacha Smith, who's shaking around a cup for money, is suddenly loaded. And he's getting money from Ferry that is believed to have come in directly from Marcello. So Marcello is funding the exiles at that point. Also, the CIA handlers are very close. They're the ones who were put Sergio Arcacha Smith where he was. They're the ones who are close with Sergio Arcacha Smith. Also, David Ferry is believed to have run CIA sabotage missions as a pilot into Cuba and off the waters off Cuba for the CIA. So Ferry's closely connected with the CIA and the Cuban exiles, and he's being funded by Marcello. I believe any conspiracy needs money. I mean, if you're going to do all of this, you need money. So first of all, I believe Marcello picks up where if the government used to fund the exiles, now Marcello's funding them. And if the exiles wanted to overthrow Castro and kill him, and there was a CIA mafia plot to kill Castro, at some point, Ferry is said to have said at a party, why are we trying to kill Castro? Why don't we kill Kennedy, dump it on Castro, and then the master of intrigue gets everything he wants, which is Kennedy's gone, and the American public is demanding, because they believe it's a communist who did it. Oswald, they believe, is acting on orders from Castro, trying to get a visa to get back to Cuba, and we dump it on him. Famously, after Jack Ruby was arrested, he said, now we'll invade Cuba. That's an awful astute geopolitical statement for a topless bar gangster out of Chicago who ends up replanting himself in Texas. I mean, give me a break.
So there is reporting like at Churchill, his
Churchill
retreat that he
Farms.
said what you do is you get a patsy. Do you think that Marcello's the one that identified Oswald, or was that Ferry, or was that the exile?
I
Who's
believe it
the
was
one that?
Ferry. So yeah, I believe it was Ferry. So Ferry was close with Oswald in the offices of Guy Bannister. There's a lot of people who came forward and said not only was Ferry there all the time, but so was Oswald and Guy Bannister, who your probably listeners probably are familiar with as well. So they're all in the offices of Guy Bannister. So they're close. I think at some point Ferry said Oswald's going to be the patsy. We're going to dump it on him because I believe Oswald was in the know. I just don't believe that he thought it would be dumped on him. I thought that came as a surprise to him. Also, too, what I would have done if I was in charge of the conspiracy, let's say, as a mob guy, I would have said, look, get rid of Oswald and dispose of his body and make it look like he ran to Cuba. And then we demand Castro hands him over. And when he doesn't, because he doesn't have him, the American public demands we send the Marines in to go get him. And I believe that if I was a mob guy and I was working with Ferry, as Marcello was, I would have said to Ferry, get rid of Oswald as soon as it's over. And I do believe that may have been Jack Ruby's job, and he blew it. And Jack Ruby seemed to be looking for Oswald from the moment the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza. And I believe I believe maybe there was I mean, look, J.D. Tippit could have had his job may have been to, hey, look, I was arresting the president's assassin, and in the midst of arrest, he resisted and I shot him. But maybe somebody got Tippit first. Something happened. Now, by the way, I don't speculate like this in my books. It's all evidence. I'm saying this on a Zoom call with you and your listeners where we could do something like that.
Right.
I
So
would never speculate as a historian.
did Marcello have the ability to just decide that he was going to go kill the president, or did he have to get permission from the mob?
He wouldn't have to get permission he's had a seat on the commission. But when your life, Omerta allows you when your life is on the line to do what you got to do. So, for example, when I was in prison, I had a beef with a guy who was at the very top of a mafia family, not my own, a different family. He was an acting boss at the time, and I had a beef with him, and it was going to come to blows. And I was in the right. Everybody sided with me, but he still is who he is, and he still has that position. So when I got a visit from another friend of mine who was equal to him, I said to him, look, this is what happened. It may come to blows. He says, let him raise his hand to you first and then knock the shit out of him because you have a right to defend yourself. And it does not matter. All else goes out the window. Marcello was defending himself, his Borgata, and his immediate family, which Bobby Kennedy was coming after. So the mob would have no say. Also, Marcello was a Gulf Coast boss. Although he had a seat on the commission, he was sort of left to do what he wanted down in Louisiana and Texas, as was Santo Trafficante in Florida. But here's some additional evidence to show you where it came from. The two biggest places the Cuban exiles were trained and funded was in Florida and Louisiana. Why those two places, of all the places in this country, would they end up in Florida and Louisiana? Obviously, they arrived in Florida first. Okay, we get the Florida part. Why Louisiana? Marcello's down in Louisiana. There's also some other interesting things. There was supposed to be a hit on Kennedy. Joseph Miltier said to Somerset, the informant, and it was taped. Look, when Kennedy comes down to Florida, he's going to buy it from a high-powered rifle in a building, and we're going to dump it on some nut and let the nut take the heat. And the guy goes, Somerset says to Miltier, really? That's what's going to happen? I can't believe it. Yeah, it's all in the works, he said. So the first place is Florida. But when the Miami police derail that because the Somerset goes to them and they're able to stop that from happening, the next thing is Chicago. Thomas Arthur Valley is in Chicago.
Chicago was first. That was the beginning of November.
Okay, so, well, I'm sorry.
So Chicago was November 2nd. Miami was the 18th.
Gotcha. I'm sorry. Gotcha. So Chicago was first. Thomas Arthur Valley's derailed in Chicago. Most of your people probably know about that. Okay. The next is Miami, Florida. And the next is Texas, which is a satellite of Marcello's Louisiana Empire, run by Joe Civillo and Joe Campisi. Okay. Why are the three places Kennedy's going to get hit the places that are complete fiefdoms for Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, and Carlos Marcello. Why are those the three places that he's going to get hit? It's very odd that those are the three places they picked, completely controlled by those three mob bosses. So now, where does Joseph Miltier, a right-wing racist extremist, come have anything to do with the mafia? Well, Carlos Marcello has the money, and he's putting a contract on Kennedy's head. And anybody who fulfills it, $1 million is like $1 to him. He's doing $1 billion a year, according to Aaron Cohn, who is head of the New Orleans Crime Commission. Over $1 billion a year. What's $1 million? $1 million is nothing. So even if there's 3 shooters and I got to give 3 $1 million a piece, do I care? So that's that part of it. Now the next layer is the government. There had to be, whether it's through David Ferry and his CIA contacts, the Cuban exiles and their CIA contacts, or Guy Bannister, somebody, and we don't know, that's the missing link. Somebody gets to somebody in the government, because there are too many coincidences that happen with the Secret Service when they make the last minute change onto Houston and then Elm Street, when they take the bubble top off, when they pull 4 motorcycle cops instead of 8 and they push 4 to the back, when they remove the press vehicle and they throw the press vehicle at the back. Afterwards, when the car is immediately taken and should be saved as evidence, and it's washed and reupholstered immediately. The autopsy. There's a government cabal. Something is happening on the government side. So what I believe is the government needed some type of plausible deniability, and we're happy to use the underworld, just as they were happy to use the underworld to kill Castro. They're happy to use the underworld to get rid of Kennedy too. And why obviously we all know why there are people in the CIA and people in the military would want to get rid of Kennedy. They felt that his inaction during the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis was tantamount to treason.
So before we open it up to the rest of the crew here, I want to ask you about a couple of individuals and their roles potentially. Let's start with Sam Giancana. Who do you think killed him, and what was his role potentially in the assassination?
Well, I know Tony Joe Badazaccato was the official boss of the Chicago mob, and I know he was responsible for it. It couldn't happen without his okay. And Giancana was never more than an acting boss. Some people fail to realize that because he was a big guy and he, painted the town red in Vegas with Frank Sinatra. He was always in the media. He had a lot of press coverage. He dated the McGuire girl. So everybody thinks he was a big mafia boss. He was never more than an acting boss. And when you're an acting boss, you could be taken down in a minute. So Tony Accardo not only removes him from his position, but then breaks him down to a soldier. So he's pretty much powerless at that point, but he's getting called to 2 grand juries. Now, I do not know if the government had anything to do with it, but I do know that Anthony Joe Badazaccato, did not want any more publicity, did not want Sam Giancana going in front of 2 more committees with grand jury subpoenas, and he was totally against it. Santo Trafficante, also in Florida, did not want Johnny Roselli talking anymore before a committee. So I know for a fact that Trafficante did the hit on Roselli, but he had to clear it with the Chicago mob because the Chicago mob owned Roselli. You belong somewhere. If I belong to the Gambino crime family and you're in the Colombo crime family, you can't kill me without going to the Gambinos and asking the boss of the Gambino family, look, this is what Louis did. I need the okay to kill him. Technically, the family usually cleans their own laundry and will kill you themselves, or they may say, go ahead and do it. That's fine. They understand. Or they may go to bat for you and say, no, I don't believe that crossed the line, and he's important to us. We're not letting him go. So at some point, Trafficante feels like his name is being thrown around too many times in the hearings that Roselli is attending. And Roselli's talking a little too much. And he's also talking to a journalist named Jack Anderson. And he's dropping tidbits about the Kennedy assassination. And he also said at one point, whether it's true or not, I do not know. He said Santo Trafficante sent a couple of shooters up from Florida. So that's possible. We don't know. But at some point, it's too much for Trafficante. He gets the okay from Chicago, and he has him killed on a yacht, cut in half, stuffed into a barrel, and sunk in Dunfermline Bay in South Florida. The body was discovered. They were mad at Trafficante for effing it up because What happened was he had emphysema. They poked holes in him and they poked holes in the barrel. It should have sunk. He had emphysema and he held gases high up, and they didn't know that. And because of those gases, he floated to the top. Had the barrel not been found within a few days, it would have sunk back to the bottom. It would have never been found. But in those few days, a couple of young fishermen found him. So Trafficante gets rid of Roselli. They get rid of Giancana. And now the last people, just to for the mafia's influence in this, when Garrison opened up another investigation later on, and he targets Ferry, David Ferry, Frank Regano, who was Santo Trafficante's attorney, sees Marcello in Louisiana and says, "Hey, what's going on with this Garrison guy? Are you worried about it?" Because Regano is completely aware that Marcello had
I was
something to
going
do
to
with
ask
it.
you about how does Garrison, who's in Marcello's backyard, not go after Marcello?
Right. So Regano asked Marcello, "Are you concerned about this? Are you concerned about Garrison's investigation?" He says, "Nope, nothing to worry about." And he said he looked like the cat that ate the canary. And he's nothing to worry about. And he said, "Well, why?" He's no problem with Garrison. Now, Garrison, it turns out, was in bed with Marcello's Borgata and was seen eating dinner with Marcello's brothers and was probably in the pocket of a journalist named Noyes, and also to G. Robert Blakey, asked obvious questions. Why would Garrison go after Ferry and never make the jump to say, well, maybe Marcello had something to do with it? And that's because Marcello was close with Garrison and Garrison was eventually tried for his relationships with Marcello, but however, he was acquitted and he was never convicted. So Garrison was, I question in my book, and I said, why would Marcello be quite content with this investigation opened up by Garrison? Well, came at a time when the American public was asking more and more questions, and they were starting to point the finger at the mob. So maybe Marcello knew that if somebody was going to investigate this, let it be someone who's pretty much in my pocket and could chart the course and make sure it steers far away from me. So Garrison, I make a very, very pressing argument, a convincing argument in the back of my book, where Garrison pointed the finger at the CIA, and Blakey comes around later during the House Assassinations Committee and points the finger at the mob and kind of tiptoes around the government. If you take what they did and overlap it, and you remove the invisible hands that were guiding each of the investigators, I believe you'll have what the truth is. And I believe it was a conspiracy with both of them. And I believe that the government has lucked out because that plausible deniability that they wanted, they had gotten away with for 60 years, and hopefully it stops soon.
So, what is your take on James Files? He claims that he was, a gunman on the grassy knoll. He had connections in Chicago. Anything that you
I'm always skeptical when someone comes forward and wants to claim, uh, claim this is something I did. I'm ready to talk about it. I would be more inclined to believe someone who doesn't want to talk about it, and the evidence points to that person. So, for example, Eugene Hale Brading. Eugene Hale Brading changes his license a couple of months out, his California license to Jim Braden, asks his parole officer for permission to go to to Texas for oil business, and then is picked up by a cop literally seconds after the assassination in the Dow Tex building. So he famously says, well, I wasn't in the Dow Tex building. I had to make a phone call. I went in, and then I went up to a few floors to look for a phone, and I came back down, and then the cop said, no, I got him in the building. Once again, I'm sourced in here. The cop says, no, I arrested him in the building after the shots rang out. What is Eugene Hale Brading, who is connected to the mob and who is connected to David Ferry and also connected to right-wing extreme groups, doing? And by the way, I don't like the way people throw around everyone's far right nowadays. I don't agree with all of that. But at the time we are talking about, these people could have really been considered far right extremists. Eugene Hale Brading, and he was picked up in the Dow Tex building, and he's mysteriously let go, and a lot of things disappear with regard to him. He later becomes a charter member of La Costa Fairways, which is completely run by the mob, which is built by Teamster pension fund money, and where Nixon happens to golf and tee off with Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, who was the chief suspect for the Jimmy Hoffa murder. So, I mean, Eugene Hale Brading pops up again. He also popped up not far away from when R.F. Kennedy was killed, R.F. Kennedy Sr. at the Ambassador Hotel. Suddenly, Eugene Hale Brading isn't far away. He was a block or two away from the incident when it happened. Eugene Hale Brading, I believe, is a figure we should look out for. I believe he may have fired from the Daltex building. Maybe his shot was the one that went off and hit the pavement. I do not know. Maybe he did get him. Maybe somebody from the book depository got him. I'm not sure, but look for Eugene Hale Brading. Another person I would look for is Woody Harrelson's father, Charles Harrelson. The reason why I say that is Charles Harrelson eventually goes away for killing a judge for the mob with a high-powered rifle. That's odd. The mob usually doesn't use high-powered rifles. And, you know, for a guy to say, I'm going to kill a judge with a high-powered rifle, you have to be real acquainted and real comfortable with a high-powered rifle. Now, at one point or another, Charles Harrelson was picked up and said, this isn't like files where he's confessing. This isn't a confession. He's jacked up on drugs and drinking, and he says to the cops, hey, I had something to do with the Kennedy assassination. I did this, I did that. Where is the record of this? Well, he eventually goes back to the police station. He's being brought in. He was a standoff with the cops when he said all this. He's brought back to the police station, and then when he sobers up, the first thing he does is says, I was just talking shit. I didn't mean to say all that. That's a guy to look out for. The guy who says when he's drunk and high, when he says something, and then when he's sober says, no, I didn't say that. I didn't mean it. That don't listen to me. I was just talking because I was drunk and high. That's a guy you want to talk to. You know, I mean, Stalin famously, when he used to have his like late night things where he'd play a record and everybody from the Politburo had to hang out with him till 4 o'clock in the morning, he would famously get them all plied with liquor while his flask, I think von Ribbentrop or one of the German guys took a sip of his flask once and said, the guy's drinking water all night. He would never be drunk. Everyone around him would. When people are drunk, they speak the truth, not when they're sober. When we're sober, that's when, you know, we have to guard our language. We have to watch what we say. We don't know what we could say here or there. When we're drunk, it all comes out. Watch for Charles Harrelson too.
Okay.
Also, one last thing, Larry.
Yeah.
Watch for the Babushka lady. We don't know where that tape has gone, and we don't know exactly who she is. Watch. I hope that comes out. Who the hell was the Babushka lady? Because she was filming the grassy knoll. She's got a straight shot of that grassy knoll, and I wonder if the conspirators, possibly like a David Ferry, wanted her to be there filming it. I don't know. I don't know.
So, Dan, you got your hand up. Louis been speaking for about an hour, so go ahead and ask your question. Thank you for waiting patiently. I wanted Louis to get through his story.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
Good, Louis. Thanks. You. It's been very entertaining and fascinating. I've read a lot about what you've talked about. I agree with much of what you say. I want to ask you about a man named John Currington who wrote a book a few years ago. He was an attorney for H.L. Hunt, and he talked in the book and made a good case about H.L. Hunt probably being a financer for the conspiracy. He talked about Hunt having a relationship meeting with Civillo regularly and Marcello on occasion. I was wondering if your research supports any of that or gives you any insight into it.
Yes, I did a couple of brief mentions of Hunt in my book, although I was at arm's length, and it's a great question because I could have written a whole book on what Hunt could have been involved in, and I'll make the connections for you here. So one is, I mentioned Eugene Hale Brading. Eugene Hale Brading had an appointment at the office of one of Hunt's sons at the same time Ruby showed up, I think the day before the assassination. So what the hell is Eugene Hale Brading and Jack Ruby doing at the son of H.L. Hunt's office? Well, okay, that's one.
Yeah.
Another thing is, during the Democratic primary, Johnson was the master of the Senate, as he's famously called not only by Robert Caro and his brilliant books, but he was called master of the Senate even before then. He was master of the Senate. Why the hell would he want to take a lousy position like vice president to John F. Kennedy? Well, there's a lot of people who have said that Hunt pushed him into taking it, saying, you never know what'll happen to Kennedy, and we'll have you right there. Now, Hunt was the kind of guy who could go, he was like, back then, you could be a conservative Democrat and you could be a Republican And Hunt was as quick to back a Republican as he would a conservative, who he felt like was a Democrat who would be good to him. And he felt Johnson was somebody he could trust. So he pushed Johnson into that position. Johnson was completely in the pocket of Carlos Marcello. All of that evidence is in my book. I urge readers to read it. Johnson, all of his congressional campaigns and senatorial campaigns in Texas were underwritten by Marcello, and in return, he would kill anti-rackets legislation in committee. They would never even make it to the floor. So Johnson was in Marcello's pocket. Johnson is close with Hunt. Ruby meets with, is seen at the offices of H.L. Hunt's son, as is Eugene Hale Brading. Yes, there's more. Michael Dorman, who wrote a book and uncovered Marcello's connections into the legal world through his politicians, said, look, you would never think, one of Marcello's cronies said this, quoted by Dorman, you would, and it's in my book, I quoted as well in Clash of Titans, Borgata, Clash of Titans, you would never think that the chief of energy conservation, or I forget what the exact title was, in Louisiana and Texas would mean much to you. But it does, because they're the guys who pick the oil, where the oil's dug, and where if Marcello controlled the politicians who allowed Hunt to dig his oil wells where they would be dug, where he would get licensed to dig them, that was something I was thinking about as well, where H.L. Hunt would have a connection to Carlos Marcello, who controlled the political machinery. And not to say that Hunt didn't have his own connections with politicians. Obviously, he was with Johnson during the Democratic primary and told him to take the VP spot. But you still have to deal with the mob at some point or another on the ground. And Hunt would know that.
Well, he met with them for a reason, right?
He would have met with them for a reason. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, look, Hunt was worth somewhere in the area of 700 million at the time, which would today be in the multi-billions. He was probably the richest, if not one of the richest men in America. Mm-hmm. And he was very, very political. He was a weird guy too, an eccentric. He carried his lunch to work every morning in a brown paper bag. He had an apple. He stayed away from this food and that food. Foods we know today would harm us, but they didn't know about that in the 60s, and he did. So he was an eccentric kind of guy. Yeah. But he was also, I feel like, could be a cutthroat guy. And if he felt Kennedy was a threat, and felt that his inaction with regard to stopping communism was tantamount to treason, which a lot of people felt at that point. People in Kennedy's own administration felt that what he was doing was despicable and beyond bounds.
Louis, do you think the exiles?
Thank you, Louis.
Yeah, sure. You got it, Dan.
Louis, do you think the exiles were the shooters? Everyone's got a role, so
I'm tossed with. Don't forget, we have Miltia saying that it's going to be, happen from a building. So Miltia is, as I said, a right-wing extremist. So we have the possibility of Eugene Hale Brading is also, as well as mafia connections, he's also connected to right-wing extremists. So there could be right-wing extremists that are involved as shooters. Charles Harrelson could have been considered a right-wing extremist, possibly.
So
you also have Cuban exiles that was seen in the book Depository, darker-skinned men who could have been Cuban exiles. So I do believe, and there's talk, Roselli said that Traficante sent people from Florida. He may have sent either Cuban exiles or Castro G2 guys.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, is whether if you are a mafioso who's paying for this operation, do you have the right to select your shooters, or are you relying on the professional CIA guys to figure out?
So I was investigated. Other than I was charged with heists and hijackings by the FBI, by the government, when I went away for a long time, and I was also investigated for other armored cars and an armored car depot. Some of the biggest heists in America, I was investigated for. Now, not to say what I did and what I didn't do, but it's obvious I did heists. If I was going to do a big heist, I had a very, very careful, and I was only in my early 20s. I was no genius like Ferry was. Ferry was in his 40s, right? So I'm in my early 20s. And as ignorant and as naive as I was back then, I was smart enough to know how to accomplish a heist. If I would get one guy to steal the cars for me, and then he's done. He's out of the picture. I would get another guy if I needed a place to take somebody, maybe to give me the keys to an apartment. The guy who steals the cars and the guy who gives me the keys to the apartment don't even know each other. I wanted it that way. Now there's going to be guys that are going on the heist with me. I don't want all of them to know where we're going after or where we met before. So if guys had a certain role, they didn't need to know each other. And we all knew each other for the most part. But what I'm saying is when the FBI came to people later on and they said, look, we have information that Louis did this. Were you involved? I have no idea. It's just the guy who got me the cars. It's just the guy who got me the place to go with the truck afterwards. It's just the
But my
guy.
question is, like, does Marcello and Trafficante, assuming they're contributing money, do they have the right to select their shooter, or are they relying on Ferry and the CIA people to figure out?
I believe that Ferry was the main orchestrator of the groundwork. David Ferry. Don't forget when Oswald is picked up, David Ferry is in court on trial. Marcello's on trial. He's in court with Marcello. They get the news. Marcello's family is ecstatic. They want to celebrate. Marcello is in deep thought. He cannot celebrate. He tells his family, go ahead and celebrate without me. I've got things to do. He goes to his headquarters at the Town and Country Motel. As Ferry gets in a car and he flies through a thunderstorm to Texas. When he gets to Texas, he's making frantic phone calls. And the guy who owned the ice skating rink later testifies to this and says, I had everything he told you about his communication with me was a lie. Ferry claimed that he went there to talk to this guy, Chuck Rowland, about buying a rink. And he had this day with Chuck Rowland during the afternoon. Chuck Rowland said it's a lie. He was at the telephone making frantic phone calls the whole afternoon. Why is Ferry frantic when Oswald is picked up? Ferry expected this whole thing to go down while he sat in court with Marcello, and they would celebrate afterwards. Now there's a glitch. Oswald's picked up. And I also believe, what may come out, and believe this when I promise you, I don't believe anybody's ever said this. Oswald is interrogated for 12 hours in the precinct. During that 12 hours, there's no stenographic record and no audio recordings of his interrogation. Well, I keep reading historians that would say, well, he just shrugged a lot. There was really nothing to record and they couldn't get the recorder on time. You don't interview somebody for 12 hours and persist if they can keep shrugging. You could ask any cop, how far will you go with a guy who shrugs? Half hour, maybe the most. I can't get anywhere after a half hour. I believe Oswald talked and said things that made Ruby and Ferry very uncomfortable. And I believe that once Ruby knew Oswald was talking and getting word from the precinct through his dirty cops, that Oswald is saying a few things that we thought we'd let you know. I think Ruby knows he's got to make a move, and he's going to get killed by the mob if he doesn't get rid of Oswald. And I think also that's one motivation for Ruby is if you F up a hit and your job was to take care of Oswald some way, some shape or form, and you screwed that up, you're dead. So he's got one more chance to make up for it if he could pull it off. That's one motivation. The other motivation is if Oswald talked and said something about Ruby, if you were Jack Ruby, would you rather be arrested for conspiring to kill the president of the United States, or would you rather be arrested for killing the assassin of the president of the United States, where everybody cheers you as a hero, which is what they did initially?
Louis, I thought that his third motive would be that he did not want to become Action Jackson, that death would be easy. It's the torture that would be
right. Action Jackson, the guy from Chicago. Yeah. They probably would have tortured him. I mean, look, you blow something that crucial, you're dead. You're dead. Especially back then. Things have changed a lot now, but even in my time in the 1990s, Autumn of Empire will be the third volume of my trilogy. By the time I get to Autumn of Empire, which is the day and age I lived in, the guys went for nothing. I mean, if a guy walked into a social club and thought you looked at him wrong, you were going in a trunk that night. I mean, that's how quick they were killing when I was around on the streets. So I can't tell you, Ruby would have been dead. And that's why Ruby was throwing up his guts. He went to shul. He didn't know what to do with himself. And he's floating around the precinct, by the way, taking a shot at getting him in the precinct, as Seth Cantor famously said later. He said, I believe Ruby was trying to get into the room, the interrogation room, and then later he was trying to get him in the basement. and he couldn't get a clean shot at him. Now, when you ask, is the government involved? Well, they had to be. So we know Ruby is a thug with the mob. So we know he's doing it on behalf of the mob, and people made that statement immediately thereafter. Hoover knew it was a mobster silencing another mob, silencing somebody right away, even though Hoover's public stance was different. So, okay, so where's the government's hand in this? Well, I quoted in my book, once again, all the quotes are in here. There's a detective who said, we wanted to, Chief Jesse Curry, who I believe, by the way, was clean out of all the dirty cops in the Texas Police Department. I did believe Jesse Curry was clean.
Yeah, and he's the one that later said nobody could put Oswald on the 6th floor at 12:30 with a gun in his hand.
Okay. Yeah, there you go. And Jesse Curry, by the way, laid out he wrote a book. It's only the size of a pamphlet. He basically laid out that, look, don't point the finger at me. Start looking at the Secret Service. I recently said that, and there's a guy who's really, really, I learned afterwards, there's a guy who's his specialty is the Secret Service, and him and his little coterie attacked me for stealing his stuff. I didn't get it from him. I got it from Jesse Curry. Jesse Curry wrote the book and pointed the whole thing to this. Look, to the guy's credit, if he's done his homework, great. I'll be reading him shortly. I'll be looking into his films, I promise you. But at the time, I need only read Jesse Curry's book, who said, don't look at me. All these changes were made by the Secret Service, and Kennedy would be alive if they weren't made. That said, really quick, Larry, the Oswald thing.
Yes.
Oswald, Jesse Curry said Oswald was supposed to be moved in the middle of the night in secret. And the detective who I quote in the book said this as well. A call came from Washington and said, no, we want him shown. Make sure he's shown. And that leads to his death at Ruby's hands. Who the hell in the government made that call? And that's who you want to look at.
Right. We know that Oswald's uncle was a runner.
Charles Dutz Moret.
Yeah, a bookie from Marcello. So do you know, did you explore the relationship of Oswald to Marcello or?
Yeah. Emil, so Dutz Moret, when Oswald was arrested after handing out, he had the beef with the Cubans on the street, and he got arrested for a dispute. He makes a call and he wants to get in touch with Charles Dutz Moret. He gets a hold of Emile Bruneau, who's Dutz Moret's close friend. And Emile Bruneau, who's part of Marcello's Borgata, bails him out of jail. Why the hell is Oswald going to the mob to get bailed out of jail? I mean, this is like, there's a close connection with Oswald, but I do believe that Marcello at some point wouldn't have been involved in that connection, because a mob boss is always going to stay insulated. He's not going to have anything to do directly with Oswald. He's not going to even want to see him on the level of bookmaking or loan sharking. He doesn't want to know him. He's all the way up here, Marcello. Oswald's down here as a runner for his uncle. But at some point, it just happens to be a coincidence that he's running for his uncle. And David Ferry is also close with Oswald and picks him, I believe, to be the patsy. I believe, like I said, Oswald was in the know. He had some part to do with the conspiracy. I don't believe there's a lot of evidence to suggest he didn't even fire a shot. So who knows? Who the hell knows? I mean,
did you come across any information that Oswald may have been doing some, running for Marcello?
Yeah. Oh yeah. He was a runner for Uncle Dutz. 100%. Oh yeah. So he was seen also in the restaurant of the Town and Country, which was Marcello's headquarters, exchanging envelopes with people. Did he meet there? Did Marcello know he would be there? I don't know. As I said, I would believe Marcello would keep a level of distance from the man it's going to be dumped on. I believe at some point when Oswald gets picked up and then it goes back to Ferry, you're one breath away from Carlos Marcello. Even the FBI, who immediately dismissed Ferry. So Garrison gets Ferry when he comes back from Texas. Garrison's the first guy who gets him, hands him over to the FBI, Secret Service, tells them, look, you guys, here's a guy for you. You guys better investigate this. Well, they immediately let him go. He answers a few questions. He's not really challenged, and they let him go. Well, later on, that's when Garrison says, what the frig is going on here? Now, also, too, just to rewind to what I was saying earlier, Garrison must have known that Ferry was connected to Marcello, but tiptoed around it. He didn't want to go near it. Garrison pretended La Cosa Nostra was the name of an Italian restaurant. He didn't want to go anywhere near that. So why is the question, right? We know why now. But Garrison doesn't go anywhere near it. But at some point, Ferry becomes a liability because it's obvious something happened to Ferry. Ferry is staying at the Fontainebleau Hotel in New Orleans, and one of Garrison's guys is watching him. He hands him off to another guy, and then that guy goes and runs out for a pack of cigarettes, and Ferry's runs back to his house. So by the way, I'm a huge fan of Jim Garrison. I loved his books. I thought they were incredibly written. However, Jim Garrison, once again, if you take that mob piece that he intentionally left out and you put it back into the puzzle, then a lot of what Garrison said, I believe, is true. I believe he's just really, really taken a scalpel and removing it. So having said that, Ferry now all of a sudden leaves the Fontainebleau and is found dead at his home. So Garrison, in both of his books, it jumps from we took him into protective custody and he's found dead at his home. And he leaves the middle out. And I'm going, wow, Jim Garrison's a brilliant prosecutor. And I outline all of this in my book. And I urge people, because I write better than I speak, just so you know. I'm from Queens. I can't help it. So, but Garrison leaves out. It's a jump. Okay, you got Ferry's at the Fontainebleau in protective custody. And I get a phone call at the office and they say, hey, we got Ferry's been found dead at his house. We got to get out there. How the hell did he get from the Fontainebleau in protective custody to his house? Can't find it in Garrison's books. So I start digging and digging and digging. And Garrison's a prosecutor. He knows how to piece together a case and he knows how to not leave missing parts, but he's leaving them. Why the hell is he leaving this out? Well, it turns out Ferry was left unprotected. When they switched off Lou Ivan and another guy, hands him off. One guy hands him off to the other, and the other guy goes out for a pack of cigarettes. I think Ferry, in plain English, shit his pants and said, how did these guys leave me alone in this room? A hotel that's funded by Teamster Pension Fund mob money, the Fontainebleau was, a place where Santo Trafficante stays and has a suite whenever he visits Carlos Marcello. It's a mob hotel. And now they left me here unprotected. And he bolts and leaves and then is found dead at his house. Was that set up? Something's up with that. And I can't figure it out. But there's a missing piece that Garrison is intentionally leaving out. Jim Garrison is. Now, although Jim Garrison, I believe, gets the rest of it right, he leaves the mob out for a reason. So Ferry's found dead. And I believe that, oh, by the way, they found that Carlos Marcello bought Ferry a gas station after the assassination. Why the hell would he buy him a gas station after the assassination?
And it was one of the best locations for a gas station.
Exactly. So the first thing you got to ask yourself is, okay, Marcello and Ferry claimed it was for the work I did from our trial. Okay, he was paid for that already, number one. Number two is, I told you, I had some of the best lawyers money could buy, including William Kunstler. I never bought William Kunstler a gas station. And he was an attorney. And not let alone just a guy who's like working on the case for the attorney, right? I would have had to buy a few gas stations. So this is complete bullshit. So now we have that. But Ferry's found dead at the same time. Eladio Del Val, who's closely connected to not only David Ferry, but Santo Trafficante, is found dead in Florida. That's an awful coincidence. So Garrison's looking for Ferry, finds out he's dead, and when he's supposed to be protecting him, which is very, very odd. And then he goes looking for Eladio Veldal and finds out he's dead. You cannot remove the mob connection from that. So no matter how you look at it, the mob's somehow connected, but so is the government.
Well, Gabal, there are a lot of people that think he's one of the shooters.
Eladio Veldal, possibly. Maybe he was.
Before I ask this last question, does anyone else have a question for Lewis? Okay. So there was a guy that appeared on.
I got a question.
Go ahead.
How close do you think the CIA then, in your theory, would be working with the mob, especially things like, there was a secret security badge apparently on one of the Knoll shooters. There was the setup in the 6th floor with the casings, etc. There was the file pulled on Oswald, I think a month before the 201 file, which he had under surveillance since '59. So it seems if your theory is correct, there would be close association with the CIA, which you alluded to, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, so the main characters that I could find, and I think there are characters we don't know, but the main characters is obviously William Harvey, quote unquote, America's 007, was very, very close with Johnny Roselli. and he got closer and closer with Roselli. Their relationship was like best friends. He was considered like part of the family. Harvey's wife attested to this, as did other people. So Roselli and Harvey despise the Kennedys, and they curse them every time they're together, and they're very close. So William Harvey is a potential possibility with the CIA end. Dulles was sacked. He was given time to resign, by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs. So Dulles despises Kennedy. Dulles isn't just Alan Dulles. Like today, we appoint anybody head of the CIA. It's Tenet, it's Pompeo, it's Radcliffe now. Dulles was an old American money family. His brother was the Secretary of State for Eisenhower. He had family ancestors who were secretaries of state. Dulles is old America. He is America. And Dulles is sacked by this new whippersnapper, John Kennedy, who tells him, look, you got to resign. You're never going to see Langley, the place you built, the place that you conceived. You're never going to step foot in there, which is equal to telling poor Moses, who went through the desert for 40 years, you won't see the promised land. But Moses knows it's God and there's nothing he could do. Well, John Kennedy wasn't God and Dulles wasn't Moses. So, it's a little different. So Dulles, I'm not sure. Dulles took the phone call that he was dead very dispassionately when he received the phone call that John Kennedy was just killed.
Interestingly, when Dulles was tasked on the Warren Commission,
Mhm.
when they were interviewing Richard Helms and his second in command, who just the name just right now is out of my mind. It was Dulles who was taking the deposition of Richard Helms, asking Richard Helms about things that happened on Dulles's watch. So about the CIA and Oswald's defection.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was the way the control was. So why would you have the person with the answers asking the person that wasn't even responsible at the time?
Right.
Right.
To create an alibi for you. It could be a million. Yeah. One thing is I'm going to feed you the questions and
Oh yeah.
feedback.
Even leading questions like, well, that was the State Department's job, right?
Right. So I had a friend way back in the day he used to take care of me. He had businesses, and not that I was shaking him down. I did him favors. I kept people away from him if they tried to shake him down. In turn, I got some peace. So you could argue that I was shaking him down. So one day we were talking, and he said, look, he was yelling at a couple of employees, and he said to me, there's a rule. He says, if you want to know who's stealing from you, or you want to know who's guilty of something in your company, it's the person who never takes a sick day. He goes, he goes, watch the person who never takes a sick day. He goes, never. Yeah.
When I worked at a bank, we had to take 2-week vacations. We couldn't take a week vacation because they said the people that are robbing the bank or stealing from the bank need to be there. They can't be away for a while.
That's right.
But let me ask you, I have this last question for you.
So that said, really quick, Larry, Dulles was the one who never missed a meeting.
Yes.
Dulles was the one who lobbied to get onto the Warren Commission. Dulles was the one who made sure he was constantly there. I think he attended most meetings more than anyone else. I think 70-something%. Never wanted to miss a meeting. Never wanted to miss a piece of evidence. Never wanted to not go through something. There's your guy, I think, at least protecting the CIA. Back to that gentleman's question, though, and what you mentioned, Helms. Helms is another one I would look at. I read Helms's book. He's as dirty as could be. Helms and Harvey had a conversation at one point when after John McCone took over for Dulles, and they believed they were talking about, would it be advisable to brief McCone as to what we're doing with the mob, with Castro and et cetera. And they felt that it was inadvisable, and they didn't even tell McCone. So when Bobby Kennedy asked McCone at Hickory Hill, did you guys kill my brother? And McCone said, no, he wouldn't even know McCone. He wouldn't have any.
I always thought that Harvey, because of his relationship with Roselli, got wind of what was happening, and he may have been the one that tipped off the government that this was a mob hit, or this was a hit by people that you were training. and this is why you got to cover it up. But that's just my theory. But I got to ask you this question. So there's this guy Michael Ferrante who went on Piers Morgan. He has a little different view of the mafia's role. Do you
Oh
have?
no, I think you mixed up names. So it's Lou Ferrante. I went on Piers Morgan at one point too. That's okay. And I think you meant Michael Francesi.
Oh, French. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, what is your take
Well,
on? What
well, actually, I think Michael's take is consistent with my own in the sense that he believes Ruby has something to do with the mob, and he believes that that's going to come out at some point. He took one step further, and I think he said that he used to talk about it with Junior Persico and his father. Um, I was around the old timers during that same time. I mean, I didn't talk about that stuff with them. I wouldn't have even known about it. They wouldn't have talked about that with me. It wasn't something we openly talked about, like who killed JFK. But that's not to say that didn't happen in his life. It could have. I don't know. But I think what he said was consistent with what I'm saying. I think he felt that Ruby was, connected to the mob. And that was basically, I think, what he contributed to the conversation. Michael did. If you watch the Piers Morgan with me, I think you'll see I went a lot deeper, and a lot of the stuff we covered tonight, I covered in the Piers Morgan interview. And then I was challenged by a CIA agent or ex-CIA agent. And, he started right away with the nut job
who
stuff.
was it, by the way?
I don't remember his name, but, it was almost like it was almost a lot of people felt that his motive was to go on there and call me nuts after I lay out the theory because
Did he write a book? Because there's a
no,
couple.
I don't think so. But look, I'm going to be honest with you, Larry. Before I got into this deep, I would have said any conspiracy theorist is a nut job too. I would have never, until you read it, until you take a deep dive, you do the research, and you understand it yourself. It's hard to believe that these things could happen. It's very, very. It's a tough pill to swallow that your government might have done this. That you've been told something completely different. Once you do a deep dive, then you realize, son of a bitch. And then not only that, you realize that the first conspiracy theorists were members of the Warren Commission who dissented and said, look, I'm not going along with this single bullet theory. And they told Chief Justice Earl Warren, and Warren said, no, I need everybody in unity. And they said, well, it couldn't have happened. There's no way. And then Governor Connolly is the second conspiracy theorist because he goes, there's no way you could run a million tests. I don't care. You can never convince me that the same bullet that hit Jack Kennedy hit me. There's no way I'm ever going to believe that. I was in the car. The third conspiracy theorist is Governor Connolly's wife, who says I was right next to my husband and right in front of Jack. And there's no way that the same bullet hit them both. So if you take away the single bullet theory, the entire 888 page of the Warren Commission report is a work of fiction, probably more fictional than Leo Tolstoy's masterpiece, War and Peace, which at least did the invasion of Russia brilliantly with a lot of facts. So,
well, what you just said, Vincent Bilogosi in his book, like around page 988, he said,
despicable.
What would it be? If the conspiracists are right, what would this say about America? It would say that we are no different than the Europeans and our institutions are no better than a third world country. And it's about really defending America's honor rather than getting to the truth.
Well, there you have it.
Yeah. So unless anyone else has any questions, it's 9:30. We've had Lewis come on for an hour and a half almost. And I apologize.
One more quick question.
Sure.
Has the author considered the role of David Atlee Phillips in creating the Oswald legend, working with the anti-Castro Cubans?
Yeah.
In addition to Harvey.
Yes, David Atlee Phillips, and there seems to be, there was a couple of pictures floating around from that time where I think he pops up. Yes, I do believe there are CIA agents. I think I mentioned at one point during this conversation, there are people that we've known, and there are people I think that we don't know. I think the most powerful people you've never heard of, we've never heard of, and I hope that they surface. I don't know, but David Atlee Phillips, yes. There were also, look, the Watergate burglars. Did they have something to do, not only with the mafia and the hit to kill Castro, but something to do with Dealey Plaza? I don't know. Did they know people who had something to do with it? We could keep going. That's why I really, really just hope that these damn things come out. I don't like that a representative of the United States government, especially from Florida, where there's a huge Cuban exile community still to this day. And I love the Cuban exile community, by the way. I know plenty of them. I absolutely adore them. They've been patriotic Americans from the moment they got here, most of them. But there may be some that say, hey, you know what? My grandfather wasn't the most patriotic American and won't be seen as such if this comes out. And I'm a big donor to your congressional campaigns. I don't like that a politician has these things. Just let us have them. Let the American people, we're not children. We're not going to, the American public won't collapse because of this. I'm a conspiracy theorist today, and I still have a bust of George Washington over my shoulder from the 1876 centennial. I love the founding fathers. I love our country. My grandparents came here as immigrants, and they made the best they could. They loved America, even when America didn't love them when they first got here. And they were called guineas, wops, greaseballs. They still loved America. And they ended up becoming great members of American society, as did my parents, and as did I. Not a great member. I went to prison for a long time. I'm trying to make up for that the second half of my life. But what I mean is citizens of America and Italians in general, Italian Americans in general. So,
Bill has a question. This will be the last one.
yeah.
Thank you, Larry. And Mr. Ferrante, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. So it sounds like you've made a very good case for the mob leading this operation. At what point do you think they connected up with the CIA where they were operationally working on Oswald at the same time? Do you think that was spring of '63, later than that, earlier than that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, things ramp up then. I think during mid '63 things are ramping up. I think the plans are starting to come into focus. You got three places, as we said, where they could kill Kennedy. You got Chicago, Florida, and Texas. All three are run by three of the most powerful mob bosses, mafia families in America. So I think it's ramping up at that point. I also believe David Ferry is in contact with Oswald at that point, and there's a lot of evidence to say that also Ruby was. There's also people, Morin Chant, I can't pronounce his name correctly. You guys would know. The CIA.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, he pops up in Ruby's life. He also then mysteriously commits suicide before he's supposed to go in front of a grand jury or a committee. So, this is all odd, but there are people in Ruby's life. I do believe Ruth Payne is a living person who I would like to know more about. She's too mysterious to me. There's evidence to suggest one of the cops said that I saw her Rambler station wagon leaving the scene and taking away people from the book depository. And that she just ends up taking in Oswald is too crazy for me to believe. And her husband is old American money who ends up working for Bell Helicopter or works for Bell Helicopter, amongst other big Department of Defense contractors. It's too strange that Oswald, this loony defector to the Soviet Union, ends up in these houses. When I came home from prison, I had my family and I had the guys that were still in the mob that loved me and knew I never ratted them out there for me. But just imagine if people came out of the woodwork from these big American families and you're like, oh, wow, the DuPonts are taking in Louis Ferrante, when he's on parole. And then after the DuPonts take him in, and then you go through this whole, list of old American money that want me in their houses. It's a little strange, it's just like too much for me.
Yeah, I agree in it. But I think that kind of lends credence to the CIA being involved a little bit earlier, because that's a lot to set up and coordinate, it seems like. But
I do believe that. I do believe from the beginning they were involved. I believe that Carlos Marcello was funding the exiles and underwriting the conspiracy. And I do not believe he would have gone full force. Maybe there's a possibility he would have thought about it more if he didn't know that the government was involved too, because he knows it's not going to go anywhere. And I make that argument in my book. Within hours of the conspiracy, the FBI not only were looking for David Ferry, but they also hauled in about 6 or 8 soldiers and captains in Marcello's Borgata, Nofia Pecora. There's all guys that are being hauled in that are in Marcello's Borgata, Jack Ruby, Joe Civillo, Joe Campisi. So all of these guys, for the mob to go, look, we could get away with killing the president, they had to have some type of understanding that and the government is our partner in this. So don't worry about it afterwards.
Well,
We
I
really
think the
don't have
guy,
anything to worry about.
I think, they obviously were working with people in Miami on the Castro assassinations, and at some point they flipped and
Mhm.
their target became Kennedy. And I think, and it makes sense. Kennedy started defunding the exiles after the missile crisis in the
That's right.
beginning of '63, right?
Mhm. That's correct.
And there was also the time, and then the Cubans start getting, they have this big breakup with the Cubans in April of '63. So,
Mhm.
it
It's when it's when all of a sudden the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
right.
And the Cuban exiles suddenly forge a strong relationship with the mob.
And
And I
then
think
suddenly Oswald goes to New Orleans in April
that's
after he
correct.
allegedly shoots Walker. He
Uh,
now spends, a couple months in New Orleans, and what was that all about? So
Yeah, yeah.
I
Yeah,
was
so
getting
it's
him ready to have the cover story.
Mhm.
yeah, it seems like the missile crisis was the last straw, and then it started rolling. So
I think
Actually, I would say the real last straw that maybe if there was any hesitance was the back channel between Kennedy and Castro in the fall of '63.
right.
And I think there probably was a plan in place, but remember, Lisa Howard had interviewed Castro in May of '63, where he said to her, I'd like to try to explore normalizing relations. And
Mhm.
she initially contacted the Kennedy administration and they poo pooed it.
Mhm.
And then in September, she has a party at her apartment in the city, and she has Castro's right hand man at the UN and William Atwood. They put them together. She puts them together in a room in her apartment. And Castro's person says, I think his name is Luigo or something. So basically, that they want to talk about it and they'd be happy to fly someone down to Cuba. And Atwood says, we can't do that. And then he goes talk to the administration, and the CIA doesn't want to do it. I bet the CIA at that point told the exiles what was going on. But
Mhm.
then in the end of October, Jean Daniel, William Atwood tells Kennedy that Jean Daniel is going to see Castro. And Jean Daniel is invited into the Oval Office, and Kennedy has a message for him to give to Castro. Basically, yeah, the American government has done a lot of bad things about your country, and it kind of given some sort of suggestions about how a path could go forward.
Mhm.
And John Daniel is meeting with Castro the day Kennedy is killed. He writes 2 articles about this,
Mhm.
and he basically, Castro gets the call that Kennedy has been shot. He asks how bad. He hangs up. He gets another call a few minutes later saying Kennedy's dead, and he turns to John Daniel and says, "Your mission of peace has just ended."
Mhm. Yeah.
I
Wow.
think that was strike three, in my opinion. But
Yeah. Yeah.
once they,
And I want to also, Larry.
Larry,
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Larry,
yes,
I would like to, Mr. Ferrante. It
who
was a
is this?
wonderful, wonderful show.
Thank you.
I want to congratulate you. I learned so much tonight, stuff I never knew, and I'm going to go out and get your books absolutely tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And please come back. I love your Queen's accent. I'm from Jersey.
That's great. Thank you.
Did someone else? Was someone else going to ask something, or were we finishing with Louis?
Just one real quick one.
Yeah.
The sixth floor, it was kind of a setup. Would that implicate then the Dallas PD, one or two, or
Yeah, the Dallas PD was dirty as dirt. I mean, these guys, there was I go through it in the book a little. There were people who said everybody was on the take, and if you were honest, you were an anomaly. They were all the Dallas cops were on the take. It was the Wild West at that point. So yeah, and someone had to let Ruby into the garage. Someone had to let him roam around the precinct the first night when Oswald was picked up. So the Dallas police were dirty. Once again, too, I want to just say, of all the Dallas cops that were dirty, and you had quite a few, Patrick Dean, Blackie Harrelson, there's quite a few. I could go on, but I do believe, once again, Jesse Curry was an honest cop. As I spoke about later, the Chief Jesse Curry was not involved in anything. And I will say this, and I never read this anywhere. If it's out there, forgive me. I do not think I'm taking it from anybody. I believe that I'm the first person who noticed this and wrote about it in my book. General Charles Cabal was the assistant director for the CIA during the Bay of Pigs. He begged Kennedy to give them air cover. Kennedy refused. I think he ran to Rusk's apartment even in the middle of the night, begging him, please get the president on the phone. You've got to save these guys. Cabal hated Kennedy, despised Kennedy, and Mayor Cabal was his brother. Now, this is an interesting piece. I could not connect the Cabals to the Kennedy conspiracy. However, other than that they both despised him. However, when Oswald is being brought down into the garage so he could be shown before he's brought over to the county jail, Chief Curry is supposed to accompany Oswald and the other detectives who are bringing him down, but he suddenly gets a phone call from Mayor Cabal, and he's pulled away from the move, and he has to take the phone because it's the mayor.
He would have been in front of Oswald.
He would have been in front of Oswald, and I believe I believe they knew they had to get the honest guy out of the picture. And I believe that Mayor Cabal was mischievously watching the hit on TV while he's got Curry on the phone. That's my own opinion, but nobody's ever said it. Again, if somebody has, and you know, guys, that I don't mean to plagiarize anybody, but I've never read it, and I think it's the first time anybody said it. It was strange to me that Curry's the only honest cop I could find in the Texas Police Department, and he happens to be called away from the transfer at the last minute, and he's discouraged that he wasn't able to attend the transfer because he felt he could have saved Oswald's life.
Dave, you're the last one.
Files and Nicoletti.
Well, we already talked about Files. We already talked about Files.
Okay, I missed that.
Yeah. Basically, Lewis is skeptical about people that try to take credit for something.
Okay.
Nicoletti, what do you think, Lewis? Anything?
Once again, I'm not sure. I mean, the main mob guys, I feel always the names that come up in my research. You got Trafficante, Marcello, and Giancana as the shot callers. Somebody who's lower down the totem pole would be Roselli, who was close with William Harvey. I'm not sure. Also, Nofia Pecora had phone calls with Ruby prior to the assassination. Joe Campisi and Joe Civillo. Ruby had a steak dinner with the underboss of the Texas mob the night before the assassination with Joe Campisi. And it's odd that after he's locked up, Joe Campisi goes to visit him in the county jail.
First person to visit him.
Right. So I've been in and out of jail for a long time. I was at one point in my life. And when somebody comes to see you himself, a big guy like that, it's because he can't trust anybody with the message. Yeah. So in other words, they send somebody up to talk to you, a big guy would. Let's say I got locked up. Pete Gotti might say, look, go talk to Louis, tell him this, that, and the other thing. Or I might send word back out. But if the guy comes himself, he's not even trusting a messenger. The underboss of the Texas Mafia visited Ruby in jail. That's a very strange thing to happen for me. Also, Melvin Belli, who claimed he took it for nothing, was Seymour Ellison, another attorney, said supposedly there was $1 million for Belli.
He was a mob lawyer.
He was paid for by the mob. Yeah, and who would come up with Ruby's tab? Marcello and Trafficante come to mind.
So just to let everyone know, one of the records that I'm seeking from the in this effort to release the records is there is an alleged confession of Carlos Marcello while he was in jail during the Camtex. There's two different sting operations involving Carlos Marcello. The first was the Bry Lab in 80, but the second one was in Texas, and he was in jail, and there was a guy, Jack Van Langenham, who was in for other reasons, and somehow Marcello got close to him. He was his cellmate, and he got the FBI, he told the FBI, and they put a radio in the cell that had a recording device in it. And allegedly, Marcello said he was behind the assassination and that he knew the Oswald family. Those tapes were sealed because the information that, they ended up not using that information in the trial, and so you don't use it. but
Yeah.
that has been sealed and it hasn't been ever, the ARB never saw it. And so we're trying to get those.
Yeah. Let me just, Larry, just to add to your story, I'm going to read it out of the book. It says, yeah, I had the son of a bitch killed. I'm
Yep.
glad I did. I'm sorry I couldn't have done it myself. That's the quote.
Right.
Yep. And that only came out kind of sort of either by accident or when they were doing their sort of misinformation to get us looking away from the government again. In 1986, I think it was, it slipped out. So, you know,
Actually, I think it came out later. With
oh
Lamar,
no, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. You're right. It was later. No, it happened in 80. It might have
Lamar
happened in 80.
Waldron was the first person to write about it.
Mhm.
And he got some records from the federal government where you could see the notes that Jack Van Langenham wrote to his FBI people. So anyway, Louis, thank you so much for joining us. And it was great to meet you. And
Likewise.
we'll see what happens, what gets released, and maybe we'll have to get you back to talk about what we learned.
Sounds good, Larry. I want to add one thing to that convict guy. Remember I mentioned to you when people are very, very quick to confess for something, you're kind of skeptical. Whereas if somebody like Harrison was drunk or high, well, it's the same thing in prison. Marcello was in prison. People let down their guard when they're with a cellmate in prison, and they tell you things you'd never think you'd hear. So a guy who's like tight-lipped forever will suddenly sit next to you in prison and say, and then I cut his head off, and then I shoved it in a bag. And you're saying to yourself, why the frig would this guy tell me all this shit? He's cooped up in a cell. He's got nobody to talk to. It's all coming out. He's hopeless. He's done. And that's when people start to like unload, and especially if they trust you and they're your cellmate. So I would tend to believe something Marcello said when he's cooped up in a cell as opposed to what he would say when he's home in a restaurant. Yeah. That said, thank you, Larry. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you,
Louis.
everybody. Thank you
Thank you, Louis. Thanks, man.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Bye.
Appreciate it. Have a good night, everyone.